Well, my next guest is a retired member of the UK House of Lords and a prolific author known for his articles on science, the environment and economics. Matt Ridley and I both wrote the first two books investigating the origins of COVID-19. Matt's book, Viral, published in November 2021, you can see it on the screen, and my book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, was published a couple of months earlier, both by HarperCollins. And I'm thrilled to say that Matt joins me now live in studio, visiting us from London. We've never met before, so Matt Ridley, it's wonderful to have you here in Sydney and great to meet you.
Sharri, it's great to meet you and congratulations on your work on this topic.
Oh, congratulations on yours. It's so rare to have a conversation with someone who is effectively an expert in this topic. I imagine when you started reporting and investigating whether or not COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, you were ridiculed and condemned. What made you persist with it?
Well, I'd written several books about genomes, genomics, etc., so I was very interested in this topic. Colleagues in Parliament were saying to me, might this have come out of a lab? And I was saying, no, the scientists have looked at this and ruled that out. And then I came across bits of research, including from my co-author, Alina Chan, that made me begin to question that. And within a few weeks, I realised that actually the hypothesis that it came out of a lab needed to be taken very seriously indeed. And yes, it was tough. I mean, I was called all sorts of names for believing this, a conspiracy theorist and so on. But it was always a possibility, so it always needed investigating. And we wrote the whole book without knowing the answer, without having a conclusion, but we became more and more convinced that actually this was a very strong possibility. And I think now it's almost overwhelming, the evidence that it probably did come from that lab.
It's so interesting because people always say, oh, there's no evidence that it was a lab leak, when in fact there is a preponderance of evidence that points to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They had serious safety issues, safety breaches. There's evidence that there was a shutdown at the facility. The research they were engaging in was gain-of-function research, reverse genetics, genetically manipulating coronaviruses. They had the world's largest collection of coronaviruses. So much evidence points to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and yet the line you hear from everyone is, there's no evidence, when in fact there's no evidence that it was a natural virus, except that this is how other coronaviruses have emerged previously.
Now, over the years, and it's now 3 years, the evidence for a natural leak in a market has got weaker and weaker. There's still no evidence for an infected animal of any kind, apart from
everyone's
the original
gone
bats.
hunting. They've
searched and searched. Whereas the evidence that it's not a coincidence that this was the one city in the world where research was happening on this kind of virus more than anywhere else on the planet in those very years before. And the experiments were ramping up in 2017 and 18 on this topic in that city on these kinds of viruses. And the closest relative of this virus that's been found in the wild, that was known up until the point of the pandemic, was in the freezer of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Yeah. So as my, we then found out that they were proposing an experiment that would have created COVID-19 pretty well. So there's lots of evidence.
You're referring there to the diffuse grant proposal.
Yes.
So for people who aren't up to date, I'll just explain that for the viewers, for the audience. So there was a proposal that the Wuhan Institute of Virology and EcoHealth Alliance, they were looking for funding for the research that they were about to conduct. And they submitted this grant proposal to United States agencies. At least one agency rejected it. We don't know yet whether others may have funded it or may have rejected it. You know, a lot of those US agencies still aren't being transparent. But that funding proposal, scientists we've spoken to and I've interviewed describe it as a blueprint for the creation of SARS-CoV-2. So you can see there in black and white how they were proposing to create a virus like SARS-CoV-2, and it involved reverse genetics and some other techniques that they had been using at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Well, in particular, that proposal involved inserting a thing called a furin cleavage site, which is a significant chunk of genetic material. That chunk of genetic material has turned up in this virus and no other SARS-like virus so far that we've seen on the planet, among hundreds. And it's an insertion. It's not a mutation. It's an addition to the to the virus, and it's the reason we're having a pandemic. Without that furin cleavage site, this virus would not be nearly as infectious. It would effectively remain a gut virus rather than a lung virus, for example. So that's pretty strong evidence. But what's really shocking about the defuse proposal is that the senior author of it, Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance, obviously he knew it existed. He didn't tell the world about it. He didn't come forward and say, oh, by the way, you should know that we've put in this proposal. It was found out by a leak a year and a half after the pandemic began.
And Peter Daszak was one of the key figures calling the lab leak theory a conspiracy in a major conflict of interest. He was appointed by the World Health Organization to go in and investigate the origins of the pandemic, even though the funding from the United States had been going to the Wuhan Institute of Virology through his organisation. It's just a stunning conflict of interest. And of course, the Lancet medical journal as well had appointed him to lead their COVID commission until...
Well, even if this one didn't start from a lab, and that's still possible, you know, we don't 100% know what happened, but even if it didn't, the behaviour of scientists and the scientific establishment in not wishing to investigate this strong possibility and in covering up their tracks has, I'm afraid, been utterly disgraceful. And it's a major scandal that needs to be properly looked into.
Yeah. I think one of the other fascinating things that's emerged over the past couple of years is that one of the authors on that grant proposal, where they discussed inserting furin cleavage sites and how they'd create COVID-19 or a virus like it, one of those authors was Ben Hu, who was one of the first, or is suspected of being the very first person in the world, the first cluster of COVID-19, him and his colleagues, and he was hospitalised with COVID-like symptoms around late October or early November 2019. So the very scientist who was conducting this research is believed to be one of the first in the world to fall sick with COVID-19 and had to go to hospital.
Yes, we can't see that evidence yet. We can't see how strongly the US intelligence services believe that Ben Hu was hospitalised with those symptoms. He's denied it. But the other, of the three who were hospitalised around then, according to the intelligence sources, another one was Yu Ping. Now, she turns out to be really important because maybe he, I don't actually know for sure, but I think it's
one of the three was a female.
One of the three, was working on exactly the group of viruses that this virus belongs to. The thesis was about the close relatives of SARS-CoV-2, as we now know them. So this is very, these are the people who are actually doing the work that is most likely to have caused the lab leak.
I think it's interesting that in the past couple of months we've seen evidence from the FBI, evidence from the US Congressional Committee that the CIA team who was investigating COVID-19 believed it came from a lab and they were silenced. I broke a story that another intelligence agency, the Defence Intelligence Agency's National Centre for Medical Intelligence, also concluded it was genetically engineered, but they were silenced, stopped from adding input into Joe Biden's 90-day probe. A fourth agency, the Department of Energy, believed it was genetically engineered. So you have all these elements in the intelligence agencies who think the virus was most likely genetically engineered, but then the overall assessment from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is that this was a natural virus.
Well, there's politics here, isn't there? That assessment came out around the time when Antony Blinken was visiting Beijing, so obviously there would have been pressure to not overplay this. And if this had happened in any other country in the world than China, I think there would have been enormous pressure to do a much greater investigation to find out what went on. And although, as you say, a lot of evidence is emerging from the US, which had been partly funding that lab, nonetheless, it's to China that we look. And, the one thing we really need to see is the database of the viruses they were working on in that lab. And they refused to share it with us. Now, the fact that they refused to share it with us, because it would exculpate them if it didn't have relevant viruses in it, tells you something in itself.
And first taken offline September 2019.
Correct.
Matt Ridley, it's been such a pleasure to chat to you. So wonderful to meet you. Congratulations on your important work. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sharri.